So I want to start off with a story this afternoon. 6 years ago, right around Christmas time, it's crazy to think that it's 6 years ago, but 6 years ago, I got a phone call right around Christmas time, just out of the blue, from a number that I didn't recognize. I don't know about you, but often I don't answer those calls. But this one, for whatever reason, I did. And as I picked it up, on the other end of the line, there was a woman's voice, an unfamiliar voice. Not frantic, not panicked, but urgent. She said, please help me. I'm sleeping under a bridge in this snow, and it's just terrible. Please help me. She had been given my number by Gideon, a friend here at the church, running the sound. Give it up for Gideon. And this woman wanted to know if Hannah and I had a place for her to stay. Now, she wasn't exaggerating about what it was like outside at that time. The weather had been pretty brutal, and I didn't really know this woman yet, but the thought of anyone having to sleep outside was a bit startling. I mean, I knew that it was happening, that in a city of our size and with the problems that our city has, with his imperfect support systems as we have, I knew abstractly that there were people stuck outside each night regardless of the weather. But here was a voice on the phone, a voice and a name. And the fact was, we did have a room in our attic, and I had a choice to make. My parents were in town from out of town, my wife was pregnant, there were plenty of good reasons to say no. And there were ignoble reasons to say yes. I felt on the spot in front of my parents. I've always thought of myself as a generous person, always wanted others to think of me as a generous person. Here was a chance to look extravagantly generous. Maybe even a chance to be generous, right? To live up to some of those liberal values that Hannah and my decision to move into a more affluent neighborhood in Beaver Hills had brought into question. Here was a chance to look like and perhaps even be the person that I wanted to be. A chance to ask and answer the question that this city so often asks of us. We'll go back to the beginning. How do your big ideas, right, stack up to the real world around you? How do your big ideas stack up to the real world around you? This is the question, I take it, of the city. Of this city, really any city, I think. And ultimately, especially if our biggest ideas ultimately have to do with God, I think that this is the question of true religion. What does true religion look like? How do our big ideas about God stack up to the real world around us? Is all this God talk just distraction from the real things of life? Or is there something here in religion, in life with God, that fundamentally transforms this life, this city, these relationships, these moments when the urgent questions of real life suddenly confront us, arrest us, make us stop in our tracks? This is the question of true religion. And in this Lent, this is what we're focusing on. We're focusing on this question. And we're all aware enough of how bad religion can be. It can be self-serving, imperialistic and oppressive, xenophobic and hateful, violent at worst, sometimes useless at best, world-denying and escapist, hypocritical and empty. It's enough, this stuff, right? It's enough to make the religious hesitant to own the title, and it's plenty enough to convince the non-religious that they've gotten it right. But in this season, we're wondering, what could religion be at its best? Is there something worth rescuing here before we just do away with religion entirely? And we're looking at a text in the biblical book of Isaiah, this ancient prophet of the Jewish people, and this text purports to give us God's take on the question of true religion. What is the religion that God would have us practice? And in it, we find something really intriguing. Namely, we find that apparently God shares many of our same critiques of empty religion. Addressing a group of religious people, God levels God's own critique. Look, you serve your own interest on your fast day. and oppress all your workers. Look, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. Such fasting as you do today will not make your voice heard on high. Is such the fast that I choose, a day to humble oneself? Is it to merely to bow down the head like a bulrush and to lie in sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? In other words, God says, look, your religion is self-serving, oppressive, hateful, at times violent or useless, and ultimately escapist and hypocritical. It sounds familiar, right? God, as it turns out, is no fan of empty religion either. And depending on who we are, this might strike us as either maybe intriguing. If you're a non-religious person who has all sorts of issues with religion, I mean, what are you to do with this idea that perhaps God shares your concern about empty religion? Or maybe this would strike us as vindicating. If you're a spiritual person burnt out by empty religion, someone interested in life with God but pretty sure that religion isn't the way to go, perhaps this is good news that God is no more invested in empty religion than you are. Or perhaps it strikes you as convicting. If you're a religious person like me, perhaps you recognize yourself a bit in this critique. Maybe this revelation requires some serious introspection about our own religious practices. Whoever we are, and I take it that we have a mix of all three groups here, and perhaps actually some of us individually contain within us some mix of two or three of these feelings. Whoever we are, the challenge in this series is to look past this critique of empty or false religion and ask, as I said, what is true religion? What is the religion that God desires? Because at the end of the day, I take it that I actually don't think that ditching religion is where we want to go. Ditching life together with God and in community, life ordered by spiritual practices and in continuity with the people of God around the world and across millennia. I don't think that ditching that is how we're going to find life. It's certainly not where I've found life. And it's certainly not where Isaiah goes. Instead of ditching religion, after giving his kind of reporting from God, his kind of scathing, this scathing report from God about empty religion, Isaiah paints a picture for us. A picture of true religion, a stunning account of the sort of religion that shapes real life in almost impossibly beautiful ways. And it's to that picture that Josh and Asha already turned our attention these last couple of weeks, and we will again turn our eyes this week as we consider the sort of fast, the sort of religion that God desires. And as we do that, I just want to take a moment to pray for us. Lord, we desire that our lives be lived in continuity with our best ideas and also then what our hands and feet do in the world. And Lord, wherever we're at, whether we're here kind of just maybe a little bit intrigued as the possibility that maybe religion could be something meaningful for our lives, or if we're here convicted that religion has been something empty and we need your help to change, Lord, I just pray that you would be with us in this space, that you would speak to us what it is that you have for us this afternoon. Amen. So we pick up in right after that kind of scathing critique in Isaiah. God, the voice of God continues on. It says this, is not this the fast that I chose? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? This is actually this is what we're going to look at today. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and to bring the homeless poor into your house? Isn't this the religion that I desire? This answer is consonant with what we saw last week and what we're going to see throughout this series. God's definition of true religion has everything to do with justice, everything to do with how we treat one another, especially with how we treat the poor. And it's a strikingly straightforward verse, right? God is just straight up telling his people. He's telling us what sort of religion it is that God desires. Share your food with the hungry, and bring the homeless poor into your house. I have half a mind to sit down and say, we're done. I mean, what else is there to say? A Bible verse like this one can make us actually wish that we had instead a tricky little passage that requires some fancy footwork. And maybe, I don't know, you could look through the Hebrew and try to find out if there's some kind of trick here that we're not seeing, some way of wiggling out of, doing this. But there's not. This text is stubborn. It just sits there, painfully plain, annoyingly obvious. It just sits there and asks us, so what are you going to do? Are you going to do this or not? It's texts like this one that make answering a phone call from a homeless woman sleeping under a bridge in a snowstorm such a crossroads experience. And as I reflect on the decision to open our home, for Hannah and I to open our home to welcome the homeless poor into our house, I realize that moment actually wasn't all that remarkable. I mean, in a certain sense, that's the pivotal point. Our friend Juanita, I talked to Juanita about this yesterday, that I was going to be sharing our story together, don't worry. When our friend Juanita moved into our home, our lives were changed. Juanita's life, my life, my wife's life, Hannah, our daughter's, Junia's life. Each of us would not be the same person today if we hadn't decided to live life together. If Hannah and I hadn't opened up our home, if Juanita hadn't taken the risk to move in and live with friends of a friend, we, each of us, have learned to grow and have grown so much from entangling our lives together, from the genuine friendships that have developed. In a certain sense, that moment we all decided to opt in. That was the pivotal moment. But as I think about it, in another sense, I wonder whether that wasn't, in some sense, the least important moment in that story. What's more important is what God was doing in each of our hearts that led us to that moment, and what God has been doing in each of us since then. And so that's what I want to consider for the remainder of the talk. How do we become the sorts of people prepared for the moments that present us with choices that are straightforward and for that reason difficult? There are moments in your life that are actually just hard to figure out the right thing to do. But then there are these other moments where the right thing to do is painfully obvious and still just hard to do anyway. How do we become the sorts of people who welcome the hungry to our tables and the homeless into our homes? And then second, what does God do in our lives when we take these steps to engage true religion as we eat with the hungry and live with the homeless? So first, how do we become the sorts of people who actually do this? I take it that this is a crucial question. As I said, we can sometimes think that the pivotal moments in our lives are the moments like the one when Juanita called me looking for a place to stay. And in a way, that's true. But usually, I take it that those moments come too swiftly and too out of the blue for us to really seize them as pivot points in our lives. There isn't time in these moments to sit down and make a good, conscious decision. Life doesn't usually give us time to put our best face forward. Instead, I tend to think of these sorts of moments a bit more like a surprise blood test or something like that, right? These are moments in which life pricks us, digs in beneath the skin, and we get a chance to see what's already inside. I take it that most of life's most pivotal moments are like that. They are moments where life's circumstances translate character into action. A sample is drawn, and we get to see, and the world around us gets to see, who we've already become. And so if we want to live a certain sort of life, if there are specific behaviors we want actualized in particular ways, the real question is, how do we become the sorts of people who, when our character is operationalized, when circumstances translate who we are into what we do, we like what we see? How do we become people of justice such that when the opportunity presents itself for us to act justly, we're actually up to the challenge? The answer, in light of a divine screed against empty religion, is perhaps surprising. I think the answer has everything to do with religious ritual, spiritual disciplines, and ritual practices. Jesus says it this way in a passage that sounds not so different from Isaiah 58. He says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds and neglect justice and the love of God. It is these latter things you ought to have practiced without neglecting the former." It sounds familiar, right? The Pharisees are a group of very religious people, and they have this practice of tithing, of giving away 10% of all that comes their way. And they're so fastidious about this religious practice that they even tithe. They give away 10% of the fruit of their herb gardens. But Jesus says they're missing the heart of religious observance. They're missing the heart of the matter. They're neglecting the justice and the love of God. It should sound familiar, as I said. Jesus, like his heavenly Father, is no fan of empty or false religion. But notice how Jesus describes the solution. It is these latter things you ought to have practiced, love and justice, without neglecting the former, without neglecting your tithes, maybe even the tithes on your mint, dill, and cumin, the small things. Jesus actually endorses the religious practice. Why? Well, because the religious practice, tithing, is not unrelated to the love and justice that is at the heart of true religion. Because tithing cultivates within us the very character that we need to live as people of justice. How? Well, I take it that at the core of our character is a set of postures toward God, the world, other people, and ourselves. If our character is off course, as mine often is, we'll find that our posture has us focused on ourselves, using material things and the people around us as a means to serve our own private ends. In such a state, we may talk about God as a way of rationalizing this fundamental orientation, that is, we may live as religious hypocrites, or we may ignore God entirely as irrelevant to our self-service. Either way, I think our posture might look something like what we have up on the screen. But tithing, a regular practice of giving, I take it, restructures these core postures. A habit of tithing shapes a posture toward the world that says that the world is a gift from God, given to us along with the responsibility to steward it well for the flourishing of others and the creation as a whole. This has been fundamental for Hannah and for me. Because you see, giving away 10% of our income doesn't just shape what we do with that 10%, or maybe if you stretch 15, 20%. Now, don't get me wrong, hopefully good comes of the money that we give away, investing either in the church or in other good things that God is doing in the world. But what happens with that money that we give away is just maybe the start. Because what we do with that money actually shapes the way that we treat all the rest as well. Because we start to see that what we have is not our own. Everything we have, 100% of it, is God's. And at that point, if you can really live that way, if you can really make that your core posture towards wealth, that you have actually own nothing, that you're just stewarding what God actually has, then you are done with greed forever. You're set free in a fundamental way. So, for example, Hannah and I, after kind of realizing some of these things and living in this discipline for a while, we just decided, you know what, we are never going to buy ourselves a car. We've never bought ourselves a car. But we might, and we have, bought God a car with God's money. That's actually important. That can sound silly, right? But this becomes a vehicle that we can steward for God's good purposes in the world. And that changes things, right? So when a friend, not Juanita, another friend, a friend staying with us in order to stay off the street because of their struggles with addiction, when that friend crashes that car and I have to drive it home the next morning from the impound with a big DWI painted on the windshield, true story. When that happens, sure, you're disappointed, big time. But all of a sudden, the issue isn't the indignity done to my property. I have no property. The mourning at that time is focused around the friend and their struggle to get their life on the right track. A story which, for what it's worth, continues to unfold and actually is a beautiful story of God's faithfulness, by the way. I could share that story some other time. We've never bought ourselves a car. And Hannah and I have never bought ourselves a house. We did use God's resources entrusted to us to buy a house in which we could live, and the purpose of which is to extend hospitality to those in need. So when the phone call comes in the midst of the mess of mixed motivations, there is a core conviction that the home in which this extra room exists, it's actually God's home to be used for God's purposes. And our friend Juanita wasn't the first to live with us, and should God so lead, she won't be the last either. And I don't say that to brag, right? As I said, my motivations are still mixed, and we've undoubtedly failed more often than we've succeeded in terms of answering the call from God. But rather, I say this to boast in what God can do through a seemingly small spiritual practice like tithing. I think this is actually the key to true religion. Not justice instead of ritual, but justice born of ritual practiced rightly. And I would commend this practice to you. If you're following along in the journals this season, this is actually our practice this week, tithing. So much of the life of faith, as I said, consists in these actually really legitimately tricky internal heart things. Tithing is not one of these things. Tithing is this beautifully simple external choice. There's something amazing about the simplicity of it. I write a check, and as a result, slowly, my heart is changed. I write a check, and slowly, my heart is changed. There are actually few things like that in life, right? Where a straightforward, deliberate action can give us leverage over something as complex and fickle as the human heart. So when I take it, when we find these sorts of opportunities, we should seize them, right? This opportunity to just make an external decision and contribute to the work that God's doing in our hearts. And as we do that, I think then that we will find other tasks, or other asks rather, that come our way. Things like inviting the hungry to our tables and the homeless into our homes. We'll find those things start to feel like similarly amazing opportunities. Opportunities to shape our internal lives through discrete actions of external obedience. And that starts to shade into our second question. What does God do in our lives as we eat with the hungry and live with the homeless? Again, I want to look briefly at a teaching of Jesus. He says, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they invite you in return, and then you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Another passage, Jesus summarizes a similar idea by saying, and then you will be welcomed in to heavenly homes. What a beautiful picture of exactly what Isaiah describes. Sharing table with the hungry and homes with the homeless. And it's clear that for Jesus, these aren't one-off kind of good deeds. This is a lifestyle that Jesus is describing. Whenever you throw a party or a big meal, invite the poor. This isn't something to add to your calendar this Friday, do a good deed. This is a suggestion of how to transform every entry on your calendar. Whenever you eat with the poor. Whenever you socialize, invite the poor. In other words, become friends with the poor. I don't know how else you could follow Jesus' advice. Probably you have to do this in order to live this way. And even if you did somehow by brute force live this way, that's probably what would end up happening anyway. And slowly, I take it, this is actually what we've seen happen here in this community, in Hannah and my lives, and in a number of lives here in ECV. It's now been 6 years since I got that call from Juanita looking for a place to stay in the middle of that snowstorm. It's crazy to think that it's been that long. Crazy to think how little we knew each other that day. And humbling to realize how little I really saw her, this woman who's become my friend, a part of our home, and a part of our community here at ECV. It's It's convicting to think how much I originally conceived of our relationship as a one-way street. Whatever white liberal guilt led me to say yes that first day on the phone, and whatever it was that led Juanita to say yes to living in a stranger's house, it set us all on an adventure with Jesus as we've entangled our lives together. And I've learned so much as Juanita's been willing to share her life with me. Experiences of growing up in and around the Jim Crow South. Experiences with the people that she's known and the friends that she's lost. And I've learned a ton about compassion from watching the way that she cares for her friends. Some, like for all of us, some friends easier to care for than others. And of course, then that's meant that together we're all having to learn about how to take our own limits seriously, figuring out when we can help and when we cannot. I think about having dinner at Juanita's apartment not too long ago, as Juanita welcomed us into her home, to her table, to eat some astonishingly great soul food. And I hear, for what it's worth, that Juanita's cornbread is going to be a part of our meal after church today. That's a plug. So come be a part of that, our meal with our friends from Abraham's Tent. And I am filled with wonder and amazement at what has happened to all of us in the process. The way that true religion, fueled by God's infinite resources, creates what would otherwise be impossible communities. These are the sorts of blessings that come our way when we dare to practice true religion. So let me ask you this afternoon, is God challenging you to start tithing? Or maybe God's challenging you to give more than a tithe. That could be, if this is your church home, of course we encourage you to give, and we invest together as a community in God's work here in this church and through various partners in our city and around the world. But maybe you're not there yet, or maybe you're not in a place where that's the appropriate next step for you. Now maybe it's just giving less than 10%, but giving some intentional amount every time that money comes your way into something that's not kind of where it gets out of your hands, right? Where that act of giving actually helps the money start to have less control over your life. And it changes the way that the rest of what comes your way, the way that you think about the rest of what comes your way. Get us into that sort of stewardship model of saying, it's not mine, it's God's. I recognize that by giving some of it away the first moment that it comes in my hands. And then I work carefully to steward the rest of it as it actually is, as God's. Money, God's resources, God's things. Second, how can you regularly share your table with the hungry? This is a challenging, this is one that I'm really kind of wrestling with. What does it mean? I mean, you kind of push back on Jesus and say, like, really? Like, whenever you hold a dinner? Like, really? Like, whenever? Like, every time? Is that what you mean? I'm not there yet. I don't know how to get there. Well, I have a hunch on how to get there. I think it involves doing it, and having friends and supportive communities where we say, like, this is just part of how we're going to define what it is to be friends together. We're going to build impossible communities across serious lines of difference, class difference. And finally, you know where this is headed. What would it look like for you to welcome the homeless poor into your house? Now, there are a lot of ways that you could answer this question. And some of you I know are students sitting here, and you have a legal requirement not to do this, like in your dorm, for example. Fair enough. But for us, and I know for some others in this community, the answer to this question has often come quite straightforwardly, right? It's just meant opening up our home. A room, an attic apartment, what have you, to someone living outside or someone in danger of living outside. And I don't want to offer us actually any kind of easy defense from the possibility of that most literal, straightforward answer. That actually might be the answer for a number of us in this room. But a couple of practical thoughts here, and I realized only afterwards that I could have given a whole practical talk on, like, if you really wanted to do this, what should you do? Here are a few thoughts, at least. First, hopefully you've already gotten a sense. For us, for Hannah and for me, this has always involved the support of a whole community of folks helping us care for those that that have lived with us. Without that sort of supportive network, it wouldn't be possible. And without it, my straightforward, actually quite stern advice would be, do not do this without the support of lots of people who can kind of help this relationship go well. That means that for many, certainly for many more than people who actually take people into their homes, taking this teaching seriously will mean investing substantially in the support of someone living in someone else's home. And that support is super critical. Second, every time that Hannah and I have taken someone into our home, we've had an established relationship, either with that person, or we could lean on an established relationship of a close friend. If we're going to walk out, which means that this challenge of this verse has substantial kind of prehistory to it, right? If we're actually going to get to the point where it makes sense for us to welcome the homeless poor into our homes, we need to be building the kinds of relationships with those who live outside where that step makes sense and is feasible at some point in our lives. We have to actually first become friends. Third, I certainly think that this could mean sacrificially supporting more systematic efforts to house those who live outside, right? Invest in, volunteering with social service agencies, shelters, places that do really important work. But even in that case, I take it that the language of this verse would press us to actually do that work sacrificially and with expectation that we're developing genuine relationships, not merely kind of dispensing social services. That we're not just patrons who have clients who come our way, right? But we're humans engaging with other people, right? To develop friendships of mutuality, of care. Or I take it this certainly could look like, I think another way I see this happening already in our community is this could look like becoming a foster parent, which a number of folks here in this community are doing, caring for children that need safe and loving homes. No doubt there are other ways of answering this call that I have not mentioned. But I want us to sit seriously with the possibilities of the kind of practical ways that this could end up looking in our lives. Finally, in whatever we do in answering this question, I take it that it's crucially important that we stay invested in relationship with God so that we're actually giving out of the abundance of what we've received from God, rather than scraping the bottom of the barrel out of a sense of duty. And if you've been in that second place, you perhaps know the difference. But the idea, right, is of this reordered relationship with the material world is to actually share the good gifts that God has given us, that we're receiving gifts from God and extending those gifts to other people. And that first step has to be receiving those gifts in the first place, or we're going to end up in a place that we're not caring out of love. So the first step has to be receiving good gifts from God. And that's what we're gonna spend some time doing now. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up. And as we enter in communion, what we do is we receive the gifts of God given for the people of God. If you've spent any amount of time in an Episcopal church, those words will be familiar to you. But we come and we receive the gift that God has given us in actually sending us His Son Jesus, who lived a life who can inspire us to live a particular sort of life in His footsteps. But even more than that, came to actually impart and give us life, that we could have abundant life, that we could have life that would overflow from us and allow us to care for the world to which God has called us. So as we enter into communion today, I would just invite you, if you're a follower of Jesus or if you would like to become a follower of Jesus, I'd invite you to come forward and to tear off a piece of the bread, Christ's body broken for you, and to dip it in the cup, his blood shed for you, just as a way of receiving the good gifts of God, the love that God has for us, that foundation on which any kind of life of obedience, any life of true religion needs to be built on. So as we do that, I'd just like to pray for us. Lord, I thank you for the simplicity and the directness of your call to us. I thank you that you just have made clear this kind of path towards a different sort of life, maybe than the one that we lead at the moment. Lord, I pray that in this moment there wouldn't be that even if there's there's conviction of a kind of desire to live, to inflect our lives in a different direction, or to live in a different way than we have to this point, I pray that there would be no condemnation in this place, that we would just feel free to receive and to walk into the good life that you have for us, a life lived with others in the sorts of communities that you're building. So Lord, come and have your way in this space. Would you fill us up? Would you make your call to us each as individuals abundantly clear? Fill us with good things, that we could be agents of your healing and your love in our world. Come, Holy Spirit.